So we are here to talk about disruption, and not in the academic way, but in the real world way. We're going to stay there. So for all of you, we're in the year 2020 in this spaceship, this time machine, and we're going to look at real world disruption scenarios. And so Chris and Hayden have done research on disruption, and Chris is going to tell you a little bit about the project overall, and then he's going to kick it off telling us about some key drivers. Some key drivers of disruption. So, Chris.
Thank you. Yeah. All right. For the last year, we've been working with Innotribe and Peter to try to understand what does the world in 2020 look like. To do that, we used some common scenario techniques where we said, let's identify those forces that are currently in place that we don't think are going to change at all. Therefore, we can consider those things to be rock solid. Let's look at some things that are emerging also in the financial services industry that we think are key drivers to drive us towards the 2020 future. Then let's identify some things that are wild cards, things that could happen, we don't know, but would completely throw everything topsy-turvy and create these scenarios of the future that then help us know from a SWIFT and a financial services industry perspective, if the future looks like this, what should we do as far as creating strategic options for the future and making investments into a portfolio of real options that we could then exercise as these different futures emerge? Regulation today is forcing banks, not in an explicit way, but in an implicit way, to really start to break apart in ways that we haven't seen in the past. We see SMAC technologies. SMAC technologies are social, mobile, analytic, and cloud technologies, now disaggregating banks as well. So it's not just a regulatory threat, but it's actually a technology threat that's forcing disaggregation of the banking industry. With that, we also looked at how other industries were impacted by similar sorts of change. And we looked specifically at Kodak as a case study because we wanted to see what would it mean to have a Kodak moment in the financial services industry. And what we found is there were some great lessons that we learned about Kodak moments, about what we would need to do to avoid that sort of disruption we can go into later. And then finally what we saw is these new market entrants, these new digital disruptors that we see coming in the market are cherry picking the best, the most profitable, the most interesting businesses from the banks with the idea of leaving the banks with everything else that nobody wants. And so how does that really play out in the future? So with that, we then identified 6 drivers. The first is government and consumer-driven innovation. We've seen in the UK and in the US, the government is increasingly trying to drive the banks towards innovation and towards new payment models. I want to have the same experience in every part of my life, including banking, that I have in the other parts of my life. Consumers rather than customer-driven. We want the same friction-free life in banking. I don't even need to have a bank account to transfer money. All I need is an email address or a phone number, and that's all that's required. You've oftentimes heard the phrase that sunlight is the best disinfectant. Increasingly, sunlight or transparency is going to be that which ensures security and privacy in ways that we've never had before. We see this going on with blockchain already, and we see transparency and security now being brought together to really drive change. And finally, banking, like many other highly regulated industries, feels oftentimes that they're somewhat immune to very disruptive changes because it's so highly regulated, the regulators aren't going to allow it. But if you believe the first driver, then what you also have to believe is the last one, which is that change is going to be continuous and deliberative. It may not be as fast in banking as it was in media, but it will continue relentlessly, and we will change the world, and regulators will actually be behind it and be driving it as well. So this is really consistent with what we've seen in previous sessions today about the new digital disruptors, the Googles, the Amazons, the Alibabas, the Tencents, the Baidus, that are really driving change, whether it be in China or in the United States or globally, from that perspective, and also this point about the government enabling and driving the consumer change as well.
And who do you think is going to win, and who do you think is going to lose, and why?
The loser would be Western Union.
Western Union. Why?
Because primarily they are a single product business right now, and there are cheaper and faster alternatives available in the market. And right now itself, there are banks and there are platforms which give you much faster access to your funds at a much lower cost.
I was going to say, it's not a very good answer because we thought there were quite a few up here that had single plays.
Yeah.
It was a single idea, a single play. So, yeah, Western Union's one, but we were also looking at quite a few of the others.
So single play companies will not succeed in the future.
It was the risk.
They'll be
It
the
was a
losers.
risk, yeah.
Yeah, that's interesting. As they stand now,
Yeah.
you don't think any of these companies would be winners in the future. They've got to evolve.
They will have their market share, that's definitely.
Sure.
Well, we thought Bitcoin is going to be the big loser.
Who?
Bitcoin.
Bitcoin.
Yep. And why?
Well, first to compare last year Sibos, we heard a lot about Bitcoin. Now it's the first time we hear about Bitcoin. Everybody talks about blockchain, right? And more concretely, we believe it's just because of the compliance and maybe their business model, which is not sustainable anymore.
Alibaba.
Alibaba.
Yeah.
Yeah. Why? I think we all have a strong feeling, but what did you guys talk about?
Huge scale in every direction.
Baidu,
Baidu. And why?
because the big data potential what they have.
So we had Apple and Google as well, because very deep pockets, very good revenue streams, can afford to test, try, and fail many times and still be at the front. So we thought, they're still going to be around.
A lot of these views that you have are going to reemerge again and again.
Yeah.
And we're going to share with you 2 scenarios that we've created that will really play into some of what you're already thinking is going to be the future.
Great.
There's an argument to be made for Big Bank X as well.
Yeah, and why?
Because in 1943, after about 50 years of the non-bank sector pioneering consumer finance, the banks decided it was a profitable business, and they colluded with the government to put usury laws in that put basically JCPenney's and the non-bank financials out of business.
And so are the banks going to be the bad guys in this next round as opposed to the good guys that we're trying to stop usury?
In the team that has been working on this piece of research with Innotribe, we had a lot of discussions, I would call it, whether scenario thinking or options thinking was the right thing to do. So I would like to use a quote. It's sometimes better to have discussions than to have arguments. Arguments is about somebody wanting to be right, and discussions is to find out the right answer. The whole thing was not only to look at probable scenarios, but also to look at uncertainties and things that most probably will not happen, and dare to go in-depth analysis in what would happen in such a scenario. I think what we have to do is to look at what the changed customer needs are. Yeah? I think we live in an illusion that the technology is going to change and disrupt. I think it's existing customer needs that are changing that are going to disrupt. Many at the executive level don't see or don't want to see the many options because they are being trained to think in limited number of options. So let's see at the options, let's reduce it to 3 or 4, and let's then make a plan and hire some of the big 5s and make a big plan around 1 or 2 or 3 of those options. But in the bottom of the organization, you have the younger generation. They see all the options. And the real challenge is an intergenerational challenge of people, how those many, many options become visible at the top. They are trained by their MBA courses to try to reduce options and therefore reducing risks. This is, I think, a very good example of something that you cannot plan for with scenario thinking that is not looking into uncertainties. Who would have thought that a fraud with testing systems would announce the demise of the diesel engine? Who would have thought that file sharing would announce the demise of music distribution? Who would have thought that Kodak would have been disrupted by the digital camera? By the way, that's a flawed story. Kodak did see the disruption coming. Kodak was in 2005 an absolute world leader in digital cameras. What Kodak killed was they got attacked in their core business of wet film by Fuji. And they didn't have the discipline to look into real options and try to explore those real options in real-world environments. Large enterprises, as I said, are getting outcompeted by those new emerging multinational SMEs. And large enterprises are getting pushed also by governments to start looking into platforms. And we see more and more vertical platforms emerging. We are moving from enabling transaction to enabling commerce. It's not enough anymore to do experiments in the lab. It's not good enough anymore to think about minimal value propositions or minimal value options. The point is to do real-world experiments, not in the lab, but with real customers, with real ecosystems, with real partners, and looking at the capabilities that you as an organization have to develop. What I think is very refreshing in Hayden's thinking is that he's benchmarking companies now on the input of innovation, which are the capabilities that organizations have to develop to succeed in this 21st century. And there are 5 categories of capabilities. Some of them are platform related, but some are related to leadership. Some are related to being able to exploit the whole information layer. So there's a lot of that material that we have now published on the Innotribe site about the Innovation Capability Index. We just have published, following the last session of here, the session about China and what's happening there. We have another paper that we have published on millennials. And if you know your options well, then uncertainty becomes your competitive advantage and not something to be afraid of.
So William Gibson said that the future is already here. It's just not well distributed. And so when we think about these scenarios, what we're really talking about is not some sort of crazy world in the future that doesn't already exist. Everything we're talking about already exists today. And when you go back to what Peter talked about with regards to Kodak, Kodak could see all the disruption going on. They had invented and held the patents for much of the digital ecosystem that had emerged in photography. The problem was Kodak didn't realize what business they were in. They thought they were in the business of selling paper to share memories, when in reality they should have been in the business of just sharing memories, and they could care less about the medium through which it was shared. And if they were focused on sharing memories rather than sharing paper or selling paper, they could have had a very different outcome.
So, everybody gets excited about Apple Pay. And I think there are lots of reasons to get excited. As Chris said, Apple has hundreds of millions of customers. They have, I think the number is about 400 million credit card, debit cards on file. That's certainly massively sufficient as critical mass to begin to create a payment ecosystem. But the funny thing about Apple Pay is that actually it's about this deep. The payment rails that Apple Pay runs on are the credit card and debit card rails which emerged in the 60s and 70s. It's actually not all that interesting from a technical perspective. The other dirty secret, of course, is that Apple runs the largest implementation of SAP in the world to run iTunes, which also ain't necessarily super innovative. But what Apple's brilliant at is the user experience and the user interface layer. And so it kind of creates something seemingly quite disruptive and interesting on a legacy infrastructure. So the question, though, is what happens if we really blow this up? We're supposed to be talking about the future. They're measuring your intention during that entire journey. And that intention is monetizable. We lose the strategy. We lose the piece about how do you take your customer and deliver commerce and deliver a surrounding experience that helps them sell better to their end customers. The retail consumer experience, which is set by Apple and which is set by Amazon, of what it means to go through a process, that experience is so rich and so simple and so easy. I mean, a point I've thought about for a long time, I think Amazon has something around 100 million retail customers. And if you think about what the Amazon website does, it's actually a very complex, very richly functional order management system. How different is it? And in fact, I would argue in most cases, it's more functionally robust and more functionally rich than most operational back office systems that exist in payments departments around banks. Yet I bet when your operations staff onboards a new employee, they train that poor bastard for weeks to learn how to use those terrible systems with green screens and PDP-11 and IBM 360 Def that runs it in the back end. Amazon has 100 million customers using a far more complex system, and not once, not ever, nowhere in the world has anyone ever been trained on how to use Amazon, right? That's astounding. And lastly, launch and learn. I think this is something which I'm almost loath to bring up on this stage because it's so difficult for banks. We live, and we're sitting here in, essentially in the Swift stand. And the culture of Swift is about 5 nines. It's about 5 nines, right? This is, in many ways, it's hard to argue that we don't want that because Swift is dealing with money. In the same way that electrical utilities deal with the power that runs the whole economy or the water that makes cities possible. So you don't necessarily want your water company to have a minimum viable product and then have no water come out of the tap, or have poisonous water come out of the tap and say, oops, wait, sorry, but we were just in beta. So I think we all understand why in financial services it's tough. But what's clear from a number of the names that we see up here is that they are doing launch and learn. They are doing small prototypes. They are doing small pilots, and they're learning what works, and they're learning what doesn't, and they're building first. They're getting reaction. They're getting response. They're iterating, and they're fixing and building again. The way banks build is a multi-month and often multi-year evaluation and planning and design cycle. And then, when you get to the end of the process, 18 months hence, after you've had your IT budget cut 3 times on the way to the starting gate, and you finally get live and you actually realize that now the product's not so relevant anymore, that's really expensive. If you could launch and learn, you get to a different place. Innovation is happening and disruption is happening at every single layer of the stack. It's happening in the back end, it's happening in the middle, and it's happening in the front. And there's a lot of value, I think, in trying to dig deep into where in the stack you're getting excited about something. It's very unlikely. And so what that's moving to is a world of best-of-breed selection, of best-of-breed technology. Again, it's hackneyed, and I apologize for beating a dead horse with the Apple example, but they are so rich. The Apple guys, they don't manufacture a single component in this phone. And what's more impressive is they don't even screw the damn thing together. That's all outsourced. And yet, are they any less of a phone company as a result? Does anybody take Apple less seriously because they don't manufacture microphones? No. They do a genius job in architecture and design, a genius job in marketing and user experience creation, and a fantastic job in procurement and logistics to make sure the phones get delivered. Why can't banks build that way? Why can't banks understand that it's unlikely that they themselves or any single vendor that's out there is going to give you the beautiful bank in the box that does trade and cash and securities settlement and dashboarding and mobile apps? It's just highly unlikely that someone's going to have that richness of product that gets you where you need to be. As we look at the front and the middle and the back, they're not all changing at the same pace. They're not all changing at the same speed. And that's okay. They don't have to, right? It's not essential that they do. And if you get rid of monolithic thinking about how architecture of banking services are built, and if we don't say, look, we're going to go from, I won't name names, but we're going to go from this monolithic bank in a box to somebody else's monolithic bank in the box, where we expect to spend 624 million euros and 8 years to implement, and we instead recognize that we're going to pick pieces at various levels in the stack which are fit for purpose and which are ready for you, that solve a problem you have today, which is cost effective and that you're ready for, it's perfectly acceptable for you to do work on your front end, leaving some of the old legacy stuff running in the back, because the front is what maybe affects the customers first. And then when you realize the front end can no longer be enabled by the capabilities you have in the back, you can focus your attention on the plumbing. And that's an acceptable strategy, and actually one which is deeply pragmatic and also deeply disruptive.
It's the business model that's so difficult to change, and that's because culture is so difficult to change. And the challenge for all these large organizations is how do they enable a culture that enables you to do real launches and to try things and to figure out what works and to then iterate as quickly as the market is changing.
I don't think it's business model innovation. It's about business process innovation, and changing processes is probably one of the hardest things to do. If you want to compete with some of the players, especially the Alibabas, etc., on this chart, then it's about process innovation. It's not model innovation. What is strategy is to decide which are the real options you want to pursue, and then go the whole end, not just in the sandbox, because the whole problem of the sandbox, you never get out of the sandbox. My experience is that the biggest challenge in innovation is to get out of the sandbox.
Yeah.
Usually, it's very easy to do minimum value proposition and iterate, and everybody has read the Lean Startup book, etc. And at the end, you have a really awesome prototype. The challenge then is how do you give it back to the core? That's the real challenge. And the problem is really because we polarize core and non-core, and you have to go the whole track in exploring real-world options together with multidisciplinary teams, marketing, IT, pricing, etc. And you go all the way along from additional ideation to getting it in bloody production. It's about shipping products, not about experimenting.
There's a little bit of a panic going on right now in financial services, which I'm unfortunately old enough to remember .com 1.0 in financial services, when there was also similarly a panic, when there was a sense that two kids in San Francisco who were smoking pot in their garage were going to invent something that put Citibank out of business tomorrow. And it didn't happen, and it isn't going to happen now either. And so I think, is there disruption happening? Is there real change happening? Absolutely there is. But pragmatic disruption is absolutely fine. The key is to be real. The key is to deliver something that actually makes a change, and not to fool yourself that having a lab, which is having happy conversations and guys with tattoos that you now employ on the payroll, that somehow you're getting anything done as a result. Pick something small, pick something real, pick something that's a pain point for a customer, and drive it through until it delivers value.